Connie Ng thought she married security, but Adrian Vale's polished charm hid a lifetime of buried darkness. What began as a fairytale union quickly spiraled into a nightmare built on surveillance, control, and secrets the Vale family spent decades hiding. Connie's quiet courage would expose the truth, but only after she uncovered what no one was ever meant to see inside the mansion of a billionaire's heir. Connie Ng always believed that ordinary beginnings could still lead to extraordinary happiness. She grew up in a modest neighborhood, surrounded by people who valued simple routines, kindness, and stability. When she met Adrian Vale at a charity event, she never expected her life to change so drastically. Adrian was calm, polished, and impossible to overlook. He carried the kind of quiet confidence that came from being raised inside extreme wealth, and yet he treated Connie with a level of attention that made her feel genuinely seen. Their relationship grew quickly, and to everyone watching, it seemed like Connie had stepped into a dream she didn't even know she wanted. The Vale family estate became her new home after the wedding, a place so grand it made Connie feel like she was walking through the pages of a magazine. The marble floors, massive chandeliers, and endless rooms were overwhelming at first, but Adrian encouraged her to settle in as if she belonged there. She tried to adapt, learning how to interact with the household staff, how to handle social events attended by powerful people, and how to navigate the expectations that came with being connected to the Vale name. To outsiders, her life now appeared flawless. They saw her traveling on private jets, wearing designer clothes, and living next to individuals who shaped global industries. Connie received messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, congratulating her for securing what they believed was a perfect future. But beneath the glamour, Connie noticed a quiet tension that lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Adrian had particular ways he liked things done, and although he never raised his voice, he made sure his preferences were followed exactly. When Connie arranged flowers in the living room, he corrected them the moment he walked in. When she placed a photo on the wrong shelf, he moved it without saying a word. It all seemed trivial, and Connie convinced herself that every marriage required adjustment. She assumed he simply cared about order and structure. The staff behaved politely, yet Connie often sensed that their smiles didn't reach their eyes. They moved through the estate with a practiced stiffness, avoiding certain hallways and closing doors more quietly than necessary. She once noticed a maid flinch when Adrian entered a room, though Connie wasn't sure if she had imagined it. Whenever she asked questions about the house's history or the Vale family, she received vague answers, as if everyone had been trained to reveal nothing. Adrian's mother, who lived abroad, rarely visited, but she called often. Her tone was warm and encouraging, though there were moments when her voice turned tight and cautious, especially when she spoke about Adrian's well-being. Connie never understood the reason behind those pauses, but she brushed them aside, believing they were just part of a complicated family dynamic. As the weeks passed, Connie found herself adjusting to a life full of luxury but strangely lacking warmth. She tried to focus on the positives, reminding herself that every new chapter came with challenges. She didn't know that the signs she dismissed were warnings, that the uneasiness she felt was not just nervousness, and that the life she had entered was not built on love, but on something deeper and far more dangerous. The changes in Connie's life began so quietly that she barely recognized them as changes at all. At first, Adrian's involvement in her daily routine seemed harmless, even thoughtful. He suggested new clothes that matched the Vale family's public image, organized her schedule to ensure she was always rested, and reminded her of tasks she hadn't realized he was keeping track of. Over time, these suggestions shifted into expectations, and expectations into strict rules that Connie felt obligated to follow. She convinced herself it was just Adrian's way of showing care, even though it slowly erased the independence she once valued. Adrian installed a new digital planner on her phone, claiming it would help them stay connected. It synchronized automatically with his devices, tracking things like her sleep, her heart rate, and how much time she spent in each room of the house. He monitored her shopping lists, meal choices, and even her pacing habits. Whenever something didn't align with his preferences, he questioned her in an emotionless analytical way that made her feel as if she had failed some unspoken test. Her social life vanished almost without her noticing. Adrian canceled lunch plans by insisting that unexpected business matters needed their attention. He told her certain friends didn't have her best interests at heart. Soon, Connie found her contacts reduced to a few approved acquaintances who rarely reached out. Calls from her family were limited to short, scheduled moments supervised by Adrian's presence in the room. Even when he didn't say anything, his watching eyes made every conversation feel monitored. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere began to shift. The staff adjusted their behavior around Connie, as though unsure how much Adrian wanted her to know. Their movements were quiet and controlled, their expressions measured. Connie sensed that they were afraid of something, though nobody ever mentioned what. The house felt large enough to swallow secrets whole, and Connie often felt as if she was the only one unaware of them. The cameras around the estate increased in number. Adrian claimed they were for security, but Connie noticed they were always pointed inward rather than outward. Hallways that used to feel spacious now carried an uneasy silence. Some doors were suddenly off, limits without explanation, and when Connie asked about them, Adrian dismissed her questions as unnecessary. Each dismissal chipped away at her sense of ownership over the place she was supposed to call home. The restrictions became more noticeable in small but meaningful ways. Adrian dictated the time she should wake up, the exercise she should do, even the tone of makeup he preferred for her. When Connie tried to choose something different, he viewed it as resistance. His disappointment was never loud, yet it felt heavy enough to suffocate her. She found herself giving in simply to avoid that cold, distant look he directed at her when she stepped outside his expectations. Gradually, Connie realized she had stopped making decisions for herself. Her habits no longer belonged to her. Her days followed a pattern that Adrian orchestrated with quiet precision, leaving her little room to breathe. The freedom she once believed she would have as Adrian's wife dissolved before she could name what she was losing. What unsettled her most was how normal it all looked from the outside. She lived in a stunning mansion, surrounded by wealth, security, and status. Anyone watching would assume she had everything. Only Connie felt the invisible walls closing in around her, tightening with each new rule Adrian introduced. She didn't yet understand the depth of his need for control, nor the past he was hiding behind carefully crafted routines. She only knew that her life no longer felt like her own, and the version of happiness she once imagined was slipping further away every day. The power outage happened on a night Connie had already been feeling uneasy. A storm had rolled in, thickening the air with tension, and the mansion's lights suddenly blinked out without warning. For the first time since she had moved in, the cameras and electronic locks went dark. The silence that followed felt strangely liberating. She walked through the dim hallways with only the faint glow of emergency lights guiding her steps. The house, normally controlled and precise, looked almost human in its imperfection. That shift emboldened her, and she moved toward the one section Adrian had always forbidden, the sealed west wing. The double doors leading into it clicked open with the electrical failure, revealing a long corridor coated in dust. Everything inside felt abandoned, as though the family had tried to erase the space from existence. Connie stepped carefully, noticing the peeling paint, the broken frames leaning against the walls, and forgotten furniture left under sheets that had turned gray over the years. Unlike the polished parts of the estate, this wing carried a feeling of time and decay, as if it held memories no one dared to revisit. At the far end, she found a room still intact, a private study that appeared untouched since Adrian's youth. The furniture was smaller, the wallpaper fading, but the shelves were full of binders, notebooks, and locked drawers. Connie didn't understand why a childhood room would be hidden until she noticed the labels: psychological evaluations, behavioral tracking charts, and school incident reports. Each document seemed heavier than the last. She opened the first folder carefully. It detailed a series of severe behavioral problems starting from early childhood. There were notes from counselors describing patterns of manipulation, obsessive tendencies, and a lack of empathy that concerned multiple professionals. One doctor urged immediate intervention, recommending long-term treatment at a specialized facility. Another report described incidents of violent reactions when Adrian couldn't control a situation. Connie read each line with growing disbelief, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. Further into the stack were letters exchanged between Adrian's father and various private institutions. Every time an incident occurred at school or within the household, it was quietly resolved with money. The letters showed how the family repeatedly removed Adrian from any environment where his behavior became noticeable. Instead of addressing his issues, they covered them up, protecting the Vale name and their global business interests. Connie found medical assessments describing experimental therapies, abrupt session terminations, and specialists who refused to continue working with the family when they insisted on secrecy. It became clear that Adrian had been raised inside a bubble crafted not for his well-being, but for the family's reputation. His father's influence allowed him to bypass consequences again and again, shaping a person who never learned to manage his impulses or accept responsibility. The further she read, the more Connie felt her stomach tighten. She came across a private journal written by a former live-in caregiver. The entries described early warning signs that Adrian's behavior was escalating, and the caregiver expressed fear for future partners who might become trapped in his orbit. She wrote about the family's insistence on silence and the pressure placed on anyone who tried to help him. The final entry ended abruptly, suggesting she had been removed from the estate. Connie stepped back, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had discovered. The controlled routines, the constant surveillance, the strict rules, all of it was rooted in something far more disturbing than she had imagined. She had married a man who had been shaped by years of buried problems, protected by billions, and allowed to grow into someone whose obsession with control was not new, but lifelong. The storm outside intensified, echoing the chaos growing inside her mind. She understood now that the uneasiness she had felt since moving in wasn't her imagination. It was the shadow of a truth hidden behind wealth, silence, and decades of carefully built lies. She closed the folder slowly, realizing that her life was entwined with a history she was never meant to uncover. After Connie discovered the truth buried inside the West Wing, the atmosphere of the mansion changed almost immediately. Adrian returned home earlier than expected the following morning, and the moment he stepped through the door, he sensed something had shifted. His normally calculated calmness sharpened into something watchful and unsettling. Connie tried to maintain her routine, but Adrian's eyes followed her movements with precise attention, as if he were memorizing every gesture, every breath, every detail that might reveal what she had done during the blackout. The silence between them grew heavier, thick with suspicion he never voiced but made impossible to ignore. Within days, the house began transforming into a place designed for complete control. Adrian ordered the installation of new surveillance systems that were far more advanced than the previous ones. The cameras doubled, then tripled, covering hallways, staircases, and even rooms that once offered her small pockets of privacy. He added biometric locks to their bedroom, claiming it was necessary for safety, but Connie quickly recognized it as a way to track her every move. Adrian no longer allowed staff to operate freely. Several long-term employees were dismissed without explanation, replaced by unfamiliar workers who followed Adrian's instructions with robotic obedience. The walls of the mansion felt as though they were closing in on Connie, trapping her with an intensity she hadn't experienced before. Her morning routines were altered without warning. Adrian dictated when she should wake up, what she should eat, and how she should spend each hour of the day. If she deviated even slightly from the schedule he crafted, he responded with chilling stillness, a quiet disappointment that felt far more threatening than anger. She realized he didn't need to raise his voice. His silence alone could suffocate her. He reduced her world to a set of conditions that allowed him full dominance. The library she once enjoyed was locked. The garden gates were sealed. Her phone was replaced with one he controlled completely, removing any chance of private communication. Calls from her family were postponed indefinitely, with Adrian insisting that they needed to focus on each other. Connie's world shrank until it felt like she lived inside a maze built entirely for Adrian's comfort and her submission. Days began blending into each other, each one stripped of meaning. Connie felt her sense of self slipping away as Adrian's rules accumulated. She learned to move quietly, speak carefully, and anticipate his reactions before they appeared. Living with him became like walking on thin ice, trying to stay afloat in a life where every decision was monitored, measured, and judged. Adrian's desire for control was not random, it was methodical. It was the same pattern outlined in the files she had discovered, only now she was the center of it. Adrian no longer treated her as a partner, but as something he needed to mold and manage. He believed order was the key to perfection, and Connie was part of that system. Every meal she ate, every step she took, every expression she made served as data for him to refine his control. He studied her like a project, not a person. Connie's attempts to escape mentally became her only refuge. She replayed memories of her life before the mansion, walking freely in her old neighborhood, chatting with friends without fear, taking simple trips to the market. Those moments felt like they belonged to someone else now. She reminded herself of who she used to be, clinging to the hope that she could reclaim even a piece of that identity. But the mansion was relentless. Its security systems were updated daily. Hallways she once walked freely were now restricted zones. And Adrian, always watching, moved with a calmness that made it impossible to tell when he might decide she had crossed an invisible line. His father's death had removed the last person capable of limiting him, and now all of Adrian's impulses, shaped by a lifetime of secrecy and indulgence, were focused entirely on her. As the weeks passed, the truth became undeniable. Connie was no longer living in a marriage. She was surviving inside an elaborate system of psychological confinement, crafted by a man trained from childhood to control anything he considered his. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury, had become a beautifully disguised prison, and Connie was trapped at its center. Connie's escape began on a morning that seemed at first no different from the others. The mansion's corridors were still, the air heavy with the familiar weight of surveillance. Adrian had left before sunrise, called unexpectedly to a meeting that demanded his personal attention. Connie felt the shift immediately. Without his presence, the house seemed to breathe differently. The staff moved more freely, the echo of footsteps less controlled, and for the first time in weeks, Connie sensed a crack in the structure Adrian had built around her. She didn't plan to flee that day, yet a quiet instinct urged her to pay attention to every detail. While tidying a hallway, she noticed a staff member carrying a box toward a staircase she had never been allowed to use. She followed at a distance, careful not to attract attention. The employee opened a small maintenance door hidden behind a panel, revealing a passage she didn't know existed. When he left, Connie approached the door and examined it closely. It wasn't connected to the new biometric system. It relied on an old mechanical lock that had not been updated during Adrian's renovations. The possibility of escape settled into her mind like a spark. For the next hour, she moved through the mansion with an unusual steadiness, aware that this might be her only chance. She collected nothing, not a bag, not a coat, not a single item that might slow her down. She knew Adrian would notice her absence quickly once he returned, and anything that reminded her of this place was a burden she didn't want to carry. The moment she slipped through the maintenance door, her pulse quickened. The passage led to a narrow stairwell coated in dust and cobwebs, a forgotten part of the estate untouched by Adrian's obsession with control. At the bottom, she discovered a rusted service exit that opened into the forest surrounding the property. The trees were dense, their branches forming a protective canopy that shielded her from the house she was leaving behind. Connie stepped into the woods with trembling hands, feeling the cold earth beneath her feet. For the first time in months, she was unmonitored, untracked, and unobserved. Freedom didn't feel like a rush, it felt like disbelief. She moved quickly but cautiously, following the faint sound of distant traffic she hoped would lead to safety. Every snapping twig made her flinch, convinced Adrian would appear at any moment. Her legs ached and her breath came in sharp bursts, but she didn't stop. Hours passed before she reached a neighboring property, a modest farmhouse compared to the mansion she had fled. Connie approached the door with desperation overwhelming her fear. When the startled homeowner opened it, she simply asked for help. Authorities were contacted immediately, and Connie was taken to safety while a team organized a raid on the Vale estate. Investigators entered the mansion expecting luxury. Instead, they found a system of confinement engineered with precision. Rooms filled with surveillance equipment, files documenting Connie's daily behavior, and detailed psychological records from Adrian's past confirmed the pattern Connie had lived through. The hidden wing she had discovered became critical evidence, exposing decades of cover-ups and warnings ignored. Adrian was taken into custody hours after returning to an empty house. His lack of reaction, described by officers as chillingly calm, only reinforced the psychological profile that emerged during the investigation. The case ignited global discussions about the misuse of wealth and the ease with which powerful families could hide dangerous truths. The Vale Empire, once admired, fractured under the weight of revelations that had been buried for years. For Connie, healing did not happen quickly. Freedom felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into a world she had been gone from too long. She moved to a small coastal town under temporary protection, surrounded by quiet streets and open spaces where she could walk without fear. Slowly, she began rebuilding a life defined not by luxury or expectation, but by choices she made for herself. Connie's story became a symbol of survival, proof that even those trapped in the most sophisticated prisons could find a way out. Her courage to escape exposed more than just one man's darkness. It revealed the dangers concealed behind wealth, silence, and a family legacy built on reputation rather than truth. The world would remember her not as the wife of a billionaire's heir, but as the woman who refused to be erased by the life she escaped.